you and I have a role that you and I are the only ones who can fill. So everybody has value, everybody has a purpose, everybody has a role to play in God's work in restoring the kingdom of heaven here on earth. But we can't do it alone. And I say that because we try really hard, don't we? We love the idea of trying to do this Lone Ranger Christianity. Some of us try to be good enough to not necessarily even need Jesus. Some of us will try to do Sunday school enough, or go to church enough, or do small groups, or we do enough service projects. We're nice enough, we're good enough that we kind of do it on our own. Right? We like it that way because we're the ones who set the terms then. We're the ones in control of our life at that point. You and I cannot, no one can fulfill their role in God's kingdom apart from Christ. That was the second premise. Everybody has a role to play, and you cannot be who God intends you to be apart from Christ. So, those are the first couple of things we started off with. But we also talked about how we need other people in our life. We need people around us to help us fulfill that role, to help us be who God intends us to be. We have Christ who enables us and empowers us to do this, but we also need people in our life. Life, church, ministry, all of this is meant to be a team sport. Because life gets hard sometimes. And you need people around you who are able to help you get through it and help you see all that God has for you. So we began a couple of weeks taking a look at the fact that we need heroes. All of us have heroes. All of us have people who inspire us, who challenge us and encourage us. We all have somebody in our life who, whether we know them or not, whether they're an example in our life or whether they're just somebody who lives in our life. Maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's somebody we've heard about that we've never met before. All of us have a hero in our life who, by their example, inspire us to achieve and accomplish great things. They encourage us when life gets hard, and they challenge us to go beyond our comfort zone to achieve these things. We all have that, and we all need that. Last week we talked about the fact that you and I all need counselors. We all need mentors. We need somebody in our life who offers us wisdom, who offers us guidance, who's able to kind of help us navigate some of the difficulties in life. But more than anything, we need somebody in our life who shows us what Christianity looks like in the real world. Right? Because it's so easy for us to come together and look a certain way, act a certain way. We can look Christian, act Christian, sound Christian, and we can put on Christianity for Sunday morning. But we don't necessarily know what it looks like outside of the church. And you and I need somebody in our life who is able to show us clearly what Christianity looks like on a Tuesday morning, when we are sick and tired of being at work, or when our spouse has really driven us crazy today, or maybe it's the kids. Everybody's starting to look next to them. But we all need somebody in our life who shows us what Christianity is in the real world. And more than that, and this is why the counselor, the mentor, that person is so difficult for us, we need somebody who is able to show us our deficiencies in our own life. We need somebody who has all access to our soul to be our mentor. Somebody who has the ability to see what we don't want anyone else to see. Somebody who has the ability to look you in the eye, ask you, how is it with your soul? And you have to answer them. You don't have to answer perfectly, but you cannot avoid that question with them. We all need somebody in our life who holds us accountable to being more like Christ. And we need that because sin loves to stay in the unknown and the unspoken. If we're unwilling to look deep and learn about the sin in our life, if we are willing to keep it unknown, and if we're not willing to say it, the sin that pulls us away from Christ will continue to grow. It will continue to fester, and it will continue to pull us away. We need someone who has the ability to look at our very soul and offer us wisdom, guidance, and input as to how to navigate that. And that's why the counselor is critical and so difficult to have. Today we're going to talk about the last role, the last person we need in our life to really live into God's plan, God's role for us. Now, I'm putting them last not because they're the least important, not because I'm trying to round out a nice three-part series where I use C words to describe people in our life. That was just kind of secondary. I'm ending with companions and friends today because everyone has them, and above anything else, we need them more than any other person in our life. Now, I'm going to talk about friendship primarily. And I want to emphasize that because I know some of us are automatically going to say, I have my spouse, or I have my kids, I have my companions. Right? And I'm not taking anything away from that. Your spouse and your kids will see you in ways that no one else will. They will see you in much more intimate ways than anyone else will. And I'm not talking about the obvious illusion on that one. I mean, sometimes life is good, and they will see you then. Sometimes life is bad, and they will see you then. And then sometimes life is weird. That is when your spouse and your kids get to see you at your most intimate. Because you can have counselors and heroes and friends who see you at good and bad. But at the weird, right, when life is just funny, that's when the spouse who is always there really gets to know who you are. So I'm not taking anything away from that. If you are married and if you have kids, those relationships absolutely play a vital role in becoming more like Christ. So I'm not taking away from that. But not everyone here has a family. Not everyone here has a spouse. Not everyone here has kids. And you do not need a spouse or children to be more like Christ. I'm going to say it again, because I know how small towns work. You do not need a spouse or children to be more like Christ. I say it again because a lot of small churches are really good about trying to set you up. Speaking as a single pastor, I can tell you, a lot of small churches love to try and set you up. And I don't want to go on the soapbox for too long, but here's why I have a problem with it. Not because it's awkward for me. Because we inherently tell people, we inherently tell our kids and our young people that you're only as valuable as your relationship. You're only valuable if you have kids. You're only valuable if you're married. You cannot be more like Christ until you are married. Until you have kids. They play a vital role. I want to get married and have a family. I'm not taking anything away from that. But that subtle message undermines a lot. And besides, Christ wasn't married. Once again, I'd like to get married. That's not me saying anything about that. But just want to be clear about that one. Your spouse, your family, your kids play a vital role in your relationship with God. However, you need friends. Because when your spouse and your kids irritate the bejesus out of you, and that is a technical biblical term, but when they do that, you need someone else to go to, right? If you only have your spouse and your kids, and they're the ones driving you up the wall that day, who do you go to? That's when we get in trouble, right? That's when we try to find an outlet somewhere else. That's when we try to go somewhere else to get away from our problem, and that's usually when we wind up in trouble. So you and I need friends and companions. From a biblical standpoint, friends and companions to help us get through life and to make it all that it is intended to be. There are a couple of stories I'm going to share out of the Bible in order to help illustrate what I think a biblical model of friendship looks like. The first one comes out of the book of 1 Samuel. And this is the story of David and Jonathan. I'm going to really quickly cover another story a little bit later out of the book of Job, but today, right now, we're going to focus primarily on David and Jonathan. Now, you know who David is, right? You don't have to have gone to church for really more than 10 minutes to know who David is. David killed Goliath. If you don't know anything else about the Bible, I am betting you know that story. David killed Goliath. This story, this passage out of 1 Samuel happens immediately after that. But I want to fill you in about who Jonathan is, because you're going to hear about him. And Jonathan is David's closest friend. And it happens because David kills Goliath. So here are a couple of things you need to know about Jonathan. First of all, Jonathan is the prince. He is the son of Saul, who is the current king of Israel. He's the first king of Israel. He was voted on and appointed by the people, and he was approved by God. Saul is the king. So Jonathan is in line to be the next king. Jonathan has a lot of power, he has a lot of influence, and he has a lot of privilege coming his way. So Jonathan is looking at being the next king, and that'll matter here in a moment. Secondly, you need to know that Jonathan knows how to fight. We see a couple of chapters before this that Jonathan and his armor bearer, between the two of them, single-handedly killed 20 Philistines in order to inspire and encourage the Israelite army to fight. Jonathan knows how to fight. He is well-trained, he is well-equipped, and he knows what he's doing in a fight. And that matters. That matters because Jonathan watched for days, weeks, and months as Goliath taunted not just the army, but Jonathan's dad and Jonathan himself. In fact, he watched as Goliath taunted Jonathan's God. And Jonathan couldn't do anything about it. Not because he couldn't fight. Jonathan knew what to do in a fight. He couldn't do it because if the prince lost, think about the risk that would have been for the army. Think about what that would have cost Israel if Jonathan stepped up to fight Goliath and he lost that fight. Jonathan watched helplessly as somebody taunted his friends, his family, and his God. And he couldn't do anything about it. Until one day, when this plucky young shepherd named David shows up and lodges a rock in Goliath's brain. Never heard it that way, have you? What I do. David shows up and lodges a rock in Goliath's brain. And Jonathan has a friend now, because Jonathan watched as somebody did something for him that he couldn't do himself. So after David and Saul and the Israelites run after all the Philistines, we have this moment where David comes back and he meets Jonathan. And that's where this passage kicks in. So go ahead and turn in your Bible, and if you have the Pew Bible, it's on page 280 and 281. Y'all don't get out of it. And it's 1 Samuel 18. I'm just going to read the first, I'll probably actually go through the first 6 verses, just to kind of fill it in a little bit. 1 Samuel 18, 1 through 6. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan then took off his robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword and bow and belt. Pause here. This is not simply a gift that Jonathan is offering. Jonathan is saying in this act, you are equal to me. You are a close enough friend that I consider you my equal. Which means that Jonathan considers David someone to be king. We'll come back to that. Verse 5. Whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. And this pleased all the people and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing and joyful songs and with tambourines and lutes. Will you pray with me before we go any further? Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be found holy, pleasing, and acceptable before you, our rock and our Redeemer. We pray that you would add your blessing to this, the hearing and reading of your word. And God, we pray that I might decrease so that you might increase. We pray all this in your Son's holy and gracious name, Christ above. Amen. I had a supervisor when I was a hospice chaplain in Kentucky a few years ago who really liked to remind us that life is messy. And he reminded us of that because we did a dozen visits a day with people who were dying or recovering from pretty serious surgeries. So he would remind us that life is messy. And I think that that's very true, and I think that we can all agree with it. But I want to go a step further and make it a little bit more clear. Sometimes life likes to make us bleed. Sometimes life is so difficult that it just makes us bleed. Sometimes that's physically. We get injured or we get sick and we wind up bleeding physically. But most times, life has a way of making us bleed spiritually and emotionally and mentally. Sometimes the mess of life is not dirt and mud and muck. Sometimes the mess of life is blood. Life is hard sometimes. And that is why we need friends. That's why we need companions who walk with us. Now, we all have friends in our life who, whenever they have a problem, they call us, right? It's kind of that proverbial, I'm getting ready to move, who do I know who has a truck? I haven't talked with you for 6 months, but I'll buy you some gas and lunch. You want to help me move? That kind of a thing. We all have people who, when their life is in crisis, they call us. And we don't always know why right away. It may take us a little bit to figure it out, but we're on the phone with them for 10 minutes and they just emotionally vomit all over us. All right, I'm sorry about that image, but sometimes that's what it feels like. They just dump everything they can on us. And after that 10, 20 minutes, that hour-long conversation, we are just drained. And we'll never hear from them. We won't know what happened. They'll just vent and dump, and then we find out 3 weeks later that it all got better, or something else went wrong and they called somebody else. Something else happens with that. Now, we all have those people in our life, and it's good to be helpful. I'm not taking away from that. And it's okay to be friends with them, because sometimes we do get along with them. Sometimes we are friends with them. But if we want to be totally honest, we've done that, right? Can we just all admit that we've kind of not always been the best friend? I've done it. I have called up friends out of the blue and just been like, all right, I'm sorry, but boom, and I unload. Or I call them up because I really need something and I haven't talked to them for a while. I haven't been a good friend in that time. We've all kind of done that. If we're being totally honest, we've all been friends with somebody like that, and we've all been that friend. So we all understand that we have friends who will need us in their hard times. And we all understand that we need friends for our hard times. My best friends are the ones who have been with me through the lowest parts of my life, but also the highest parts of my life. And that's what I want to focus on right now. We'll come back to the lowest part. My best friends, first of all, I was talking with somebody else yesterday, and he made me realize something. My best friends are not preachers. And I say that because he assumed, as a pastor, my best friends were pastors. I have really good friends who are pastors. My best friend is a chaplain in Columbus, who's a hospice chaplain. He's my best friend from college. You'll hear about him in a little bit. But my other good friends, I got a friend who's an actuary in Chicago. I have a friend who is a social studies teacher in Louisville. I got a friend who works at Meyer in Dayton. And I have another good friend who he works at a hospital in Washington State. And I say that because I'm a real person. Like, I'm not just somebody who gets up, I pick up my God phone, and everything is perfect in my life. I am a real person with friends who are not pastors sometimes. And that's important. I've been friends with these guys for years. And we have walked with each other through really hard times. We have walked with each other through illnesses, through diseases. We've walked with each other through physical injuries, through mental injuries. We've walked with each other through getting fired. We've walked with each other through divorces. We've walked with each other when some of our friends have attempted suicide. We have walked through the crap with each other. And here's why that matters. Because when life starts to go our way, when we start to succeed a little bit, we insist on celebrating with each other. These are the same friends who, in August, in a couple of months, they're coming in town for a weekend, so there is a decent chance you'll get to meet some of them. And if you ask, and you won't have to ask hard, you will get some embarrassing stories and plenty of jokes about me. Because good friends like to bust shots. We've been through a lot of hard times with each other. But we also know that it is important to celebrate with each other. Because we've gone through the hard times, we know what victory feels like. So we insist on celebrating with each other. They're coming in town in August, and we're going to play board games all weekend and be geeky like that, because that's what we do. But I am moving forward in the ordination process, and they have been with me for much of that time. They have watched me suffer through making my own mistakes and through creating some new ones as I have finally reached this point. So we're going to get together in August and celebrate. My friend in Louisville is getting remarried next month. We are celebrating his marriage in August. My friend in Chicago recently passed an actuarial exam, and he is likely to get a promotion for it. So we are celebrating together. We have been with each other through failures, through setbacks, through hardships. So when we get the chance, we make sure we get together and celebrate with each other. David and Jonathan forged a friendship in some of the most difficult circumstances imaginable. In warfare, David fought next to Jonathan. For weeks and months, they watched as friends, as family members, fought and died. It is one of the most grueling experiences imaginable, and it creates the strongest relationships and friendships. So David and Jonathan come out of that crucible as friends. And when they get home, as David is walking into town, the women and the people in town have come out to celebrate David's victories. Saul, the king, gets jealous. Jonathan's dad gets jealous because they're singing about David and not about Saul. Jonathan couldn't care less about that because his friend is being celebrated. His friend is victorious. Jonathan and David understood that you have to celebrate the victories when they show up, and they insist on celebrating with each other. It's not just enough to walk with each other through the hard times and be there for each other. When you have something to celebrate, you bring your friends along because you understand that you did not accomplish whatever is going on in your life apart from them. They deserve that victory and that celebration as much as you do. So you insist on having them there to celebrate that. And you insist on being there to celebrate their victories. You insist on being there for the good times and the bad. It's not just bad. We all have friends who do that. It is about the good and the bad. We all need to celebrate with each other in order to truly be who Christ intended us to be. Heaven is not doom and gloom. It is not mopey. It is not sitting around saying, well, I guess I made it. Hooray. Heaven is worship of God. We will be celebrating for eternity in the presence of the Almighty. Call it practice if you want. We need to celebrate with our friends because they have helped us get to where we are. But the best celebrations come because you understand hardship, right? You celebrate the longevity of a marriage because you know how hard you had to work to get there. So when life goes well in that marriage, you want to celebrate it. When you succeed, it's all the more meaningful because of how difficult it was to get there. Real friends understand that life will make you bleed, but they will not let you bleed alone. A real biblical friend will not let you bleed alone. I don't know how many of you have read the book of Job. If you have, congratulations. If you have not, I'm not telling you to go home and read it. because you have to be in the right mood to enjoy the book of Job. And enjoy is a bit of a stretch. Job's story begins by God declaring him righteous. Job is one of the most righteous, if not the most righteous person on the planet at his time. And he is happy, he is wealthy, and he is healthy. I'm going to pause here for one moment. Those two things are separate. We're going to talk about that in a few weeks. But just because you are righteous does not mean your life is going to be happy, healthy, and wealthy. And just because you have what seems like a happy, healthy, and wealthy life does not mean that you are righteous. Those are not correlated. This is just Job's story. Job had a great family. Job had a lot of resources. Job had a very happy life. And he had a fantastic relationship with God. Until everything fell apart in just a few weeks. Job watched as his friends and his family were carried off by raiders and pillagers. He watched as his family was killed or kidnapped. He watched as his resources were pillaged and burned and stolen. He watched as his house burned to the ground. He even watched as his own health deteriorated. Job developed lesions and boils. It got to the point where Job could only sit on the ruin that was his house and wonder what happened. He sat in a stunned, mournful silence, trying desperately to figure out what to do next. And that continued. That continued even after Job's friends were coming to visit him. Job had 3 friends who showed up, and on their way, when they saw Job from a distance, it says in chapter 2, they saw Job at a distance, and they tore their clothing, and they put sackcloth and ashes on. This is an act of solidarity. They recognize that their friend is suffering, so they have bonded themselves to suffer with him. They have said, we will suffer. We will bleed with you. And Job's friends do something that all of us have to learn how to do. And I'm going to say this because a lot of times people will say, I just don't know what to say. Job's friends demonstrate the exact response we need to have when a friend is suffering. They show up, and they sit down next to Job, and for 1 week they don't say anything. They sit and grieve and mourn with Job. They suffer with their friend. They bleed with their friend because life has made him bleed. They don't try to fix it. They don't try to tell him what to do next. I mean, they get to that, and that's when they screw up. They begin to tell Job what he did wrong, and God shows up and kind of puts the smack down on him. But Job's friends sit and bleed with Job for a week before they say one word. We need friends who bleed with us. My best friend in college, he and I went through 4 years of ROTC that we still get frustrated about it to this day. We have the ability to tell stories to each other by simply saying words and phrases to each other. We don't have to unpack it anymore. We just say Robin Sage or Frankfurt, and we know exactly what we're talking about. So when we were at chaplain training a few years ago, and I was finishing up what the Army needed me to do there, I had been dating a girl for a couple of years, and we were all friends. We all knew each other fairly well, and as you imagine, after a couple of years, things were somewhat serious. Okay, somewhat downplaying that. I had actually begun to start thinking about what engagement would look like. There was still something that was funny about it, something that still needed to get ironed out before then, but I had started that process. That is until a couple of weeks before the training ended. And when she and I had a face-to-face conversation over Skype, and she said, I don't feel the same way about you, and we ended a 2-year relationship, I sat in stunned silence for the better part of a week. Now, here's the problem. I had training I had to go to. I had a record PT test, which means that it's like the official one, the next day. I had classes I had to go to. I had training I had to finish out. So I had 4 or 5 days of just trying to get through. And it wasn't until Saturday when my best friend Zach and I sat down behind the Marriott in Columbia, South Carolina, at a picnic table. And we suffered with each other. And he bled with me. He listened to me rant and rave. We got angry together. We got sad together. And we laughed together. He didn't try to tell me what I needed to do next. He didn't try to tell me what the right course of action is. He just sat there and suffered with me. So when the time came last year, when he told me that his wife of 7 years and he were getting a divorce, it broke my heart. I stood up in their wedding. I grinned like an idiot because it's what I do in weddings. I was friends with her. She's a good person. And it just didn't work. So when he called me and told me, that Friday night, I drove to Cincinnati, and I sat in his apartment with him. And I suffered with him. And I bled with him. Life has a way of making us bleed. We need people who will bleed with us. But more than that, you and I have to be, we have got to be the people who will bleed with others. We cannot say we love someone. We cannot say we care about someone if we are willing to let them suffer alone. You do not need to bleed with everyone. You do not need to suffer with everyone. But the friends you call dearest are the ones you cannot leave alone. If you and I want to be a biblical friend, if you and I want to be the kind of friend that Christ intended for us to be, we cannot let our dearest friends bleed alone. Because when Christ was in the garden on his last night, he didn't want somebody around him to inspire him and challenge him to go out of his comfort zone and accomplish great things. Christ didn't want a champion or a hero on that last night. He didn't want a mentor or a counselor who was going to offer him wisdom and insight and show him how to best get through this. He didn't want somebody to talk him through this. He wanted people who were going to stay with him. He wanted his friends to be with him. He pulled 2 of his dearest friends, Peter and John, and a 3rd disciple, into the garden so that they could bleed with him. You and I, if we are intended to be the friends that Christ needs us and calls us to be, we cannot let our friends bleed alone. Because Christ bled for us.